a scared jackrabbit, okay? And I'm sure my brother would have too, and what have you. Thank God he doesn't show us the whole nut at the beginning, because he'd say, well, I'm out of here, okay? But I made up my mind. Well, first of all, let me just say, when I was pastoring, first of all, I ran from God. Most of you have heard my testimony, but I ran from God for a lot of years, okay? I knew from the time I was 13 years old that God had his hand on my life, or at least wanted to use me. I did not get saved till I was 25 because I didn't want to get saved. I didn't want to get saved. I grew up in the church. Any PKs here? Any pastors' kids here? How many pastors' kids we got here? Okay. Well, let me tell you something. I was a PK, and I saw the church. I saw Christians, and I didn't like what I saw. Now, I'm 62 years old. I know I don't look it, but that's all right. I'm 62. And I will tell you something right now. I've raised Labrador Retrievers. I've raised a lot of labs over the years, and the fun of it. And I've had hundreds of labs, pups, and my present lab, I had his great-grandfather, his grandfather, his father, and now him. He's the last of the generation. You know what? I have never had a Labrador Retriever. I started raising labs at 76. I've never had a Labrador Retriever bite me one time. But I got teeth marks all over me, Christians. Now, I'll tell you something right now. The more I see Christians, the better I like my Labrador Retrievers. Now, if you're not in full-time ministry or haven't served the Lord, you won't understand that statement. But I grew up in a pastor's home. And I grew up, by the way, in a home where back then the Sunday morning offering went to pay the church expenses. The Sunday night offering went to the pastor's family. And I can remember as a little boy watching that offering plate go by and saying to my sister, we're going to starve to death this week. And there were weeks I thought we were going to starve to death. But we always had enough. I knew we had enough, and I knew we'd eaten enough, because when I asked for more, my mother said, no, you've had enough. And I said, well, okay, that's what we had. But I didn't want to serve God. I didn't want to serve God because for me it meant starving to death. That we never did. But, you know, my grandmother worked for Fashion Park in Rochester. She was a seamstress. And back then there was a company in the States called GLF. It was a feed store. Became Agway. And if you bought rabbit food, you got it in burlap bags with little rabbits on it. You bought chicken feed, they had little chickens on it. And my grandmother would take those burlap bags and soak them and soften them and whatever. She'd make little shirts for me. And I remember in second grade, a little girl said, Fletcher got a feed bag on, Fletcher got a feed bag on. And I remember going home and crying to my mom and saying, Mommy, how come I have to wear feed bags? And if my parents, if they made any mistake, and I would caution every one of you parents, don't do this. But if my parents made any mistake in my life, it was any time I couldn't have something, or any time that we didn't have something, it was because we served the Lord. And I cautioned my staff. I said, you know what? You need to teach your children to live by faith. You need to have a prayer list in that home, and you need to touch, and pray together and claim God's blessings and God's answers to prayer and whatever. But I didn't want to serve God. Matter of fact, the night I finally got saved, a little old lady that knew me well was sitting in the second row. I was kneeling at the altar crying, asking Christ to save me. And when I surrendered to preach, she said, oh, praise the Lord. Praise the Lord, nothing. I just surrendered to starve to death. I hope you know that. But I knew what God wanted me to do. And wasn't very, well, matter of fact, when I started the church, I started a program called Youth Time at the same time, with 3 local kids. I went around the neighborhood, got 3 kids come in and play kickball. Now try that sometime. You and 3 kids playing kickball. That was fun. But I told these kids what I wanted to do, and my burden has always been for the unchurched kid. And now we got a lot of unchurched kids. Because if you don't think we're in a mess, here's what you do. Take the total number of kids in Toronto. Take the total number of kids. What do you got, about 7 million people in this general area around here? Take the number of kids in this area, or in any city in America or Canada, and then take the Bible-believing, Bible-preaching churches. I'm not talking about the ones that got a book Bible in there someplace. I'm talking about the churches where somebody goes and the preacher says, you need to be born again. I'm talking about the churches that are preaching salvation. And then add up all the children that were in those churches this past Sunday, and I will guarantee you on my life, you don't have 2% of the children in any city in Canada or the U.S. in a Bible-believing, Bible-preaching, soul-winning church now on in Sunday morning. That's the mess we're in. And so I started working with kids on the street. And that youth program grew and grew and grew, and when I left 7 years later, we were running about 1,000 kids every Friday night. We had programs for juniors, we had junior kids, we had programs for teenagers, we had programs for college and career age kids, we had our own youth centers. But you know, in 1974, I never had a kid come to me and say, my sister's trying to get me into drugs. My daddy's molesting me. I'm thinking of killing myself. But by 1980, see, when I started in the ministry, America and Canada were still in that mode of denying they even had a drug problem, pretending we didn't have these problems. And by the way, about 10 years later, then the church started pretending, saying, well, thank God these things are out in the world. They're not in the church. Hello? So I watched these kids. And then, of course, I've been on the radio 35 years, so you, or people like you, were calling and saying, Pastor, my son's a good boy. He's a great kid. He hasn't had too much involvement by his dad in his life, and he got in with the wrong crowd, and then he got into some trouble, and now they want to send him to a reform school. Pastor, what can we do? Because I was talking about kids all the time. And I was working with a fellow by the name of Lester Roloff. How many of you know that name, Lester Roloff? Anybody ever got involved with Roloff was ruined for the rest of their life. I told him that many times. I said, you ruined him. But he had a home down in Texas. And that's where the seed started getting planted. But I was starting to live like a human being. See, I started a church with 6 people. My wife, my brother-in-law, his girlfriend, my secretary, and her mother. Now, you pastors who, they come in here, you're preaching right at me. Well, when you only got 5 other people you're preaching to, and you got to live with one of them, you got to be a little careful here, all right? Well, I started a church with 5 people plus myself. And it grew and it grew and it grew, and God was blessing, whatever. Well, now, flip ahead about 6 years, and I even got a almost new car now. I took 2 Lincoln Continentals down and sold them and lived off the money from them. I bought a 67 Volkswagen. It was Bertha, we called it. The running board's flat because I went down the road. And it was dual air conditioning. There was a hole on her side and a hole on my side. No joke. I used to buy a new Lincoln every year, and we had a town car and a Mark IV, and when I went down and sold those, I paid more sales tax on the last Lincoln I bought than I did for that Volkswagen. And Hart Taylor Lincoln Mercury, Dave Hart, looked at me and he said, you are out of your mind. You're doing what? Well, I knew I wasn't going to make an income. By the way, that was 37 years ago. I still do not take a salary from my ministry. I never have, never will. I live on missionary support. I don't get a salary. I take very little expenses. And everybody knows, you come see my house. We have a comfortable home, but it's a 3-bedroom ranch home. You've been there and what have you. I don't have multi-million-dollar homes like others. And because that was my commitment. When I started in the ministry, I said, Lord, it's going to be you and me. Matter of fact, there's a song, I played it on the radio once in a while, called You and Me, Jesus, we sure fooled them all. I literally had friends down at the country club that had a pool. They literally had a pool on how long. You heard Fletcher got religion, didn't you? How long do you think this is going to last? I bet you'll be back here drinking about 6 months from now. You know, 3 months from now. I'll take 60 days. They had a pool. But I began working with these kids. And from 1974 to 1980, things changed in America and Canada. And our kids began to die. 1974, there wasn't even a word called teen suicide in our vocabulary. Yesterday, a mama called me about her 14-year-old that committed suicide, and the other day, a 13-year-old boy overdosed of Oxycontin, and we got 10 and 11-year-old kids killing themselves now, folks. It's not uncommon for us to take a girl into Freedom Village who's been sexually active now since she's been 8, 9, 10. Oh yeah, the average young person in Canada and America starts into pornography at 11, drugs 11.6, and sexually active 11.9, average. That's where we are today. But understand, by 1980, I'm getting these calls from people off the radio, and their kids are going into state facilities or juvenile detention homes, or they're running away from home. And these kids that I'm dealing with at youth time, they're coming to me and they're telling me about the hopeless scenario. And I when I talked to Roloff about it, he said, I told you. Fletcher, you need to understand, you're dealing with kids who are going to die if they don't get away from the environment they're in. If they stay in the environment they're in, they do not have a chance. They've got to get away from those drugs. They've got to get away from that abuse. That's why I started this home. And he said, that's why you'll start one.